The night they tried to sell my future, the only man everyone feared was the first one who refused to buy me. I never imagined my life could be measured by a signature. 24 years old, working double shifts at a rehabilitation clinic outside Chicago, counting every dollar in a coffee can above the refrigerator, I believed exhaustion was the hardest thing I would ever survive. Then Noah collapsed in our apartment kitchen. The sound of the glass hitting the tiles still echoes in my head. 1 second he was laughing about beating my high score in an old video game, and the next he was on the floor, struggling to breathe. The emergency room lights were painfully bright. Machines hummed. Nurses hurried past with calm faces that somehow made everything feel even more frightening. A cardiologist finally walked into the consultation room carrying a folder that looked far too thin to hold the weight of our future. The surgery could save my little brother's life, he explained gently, but it had to happen soon. Insurance covered part of it. The rest might as well have been $1 million to someone like me. I smiled because Noah was watching. I promised him everything would be okay because that's what older sisters do. We lie with love when the truth is too heavy for a 14-year-old heart. 3 days later, every bank had rejected my application. Every charity told me the waiting list was months long. Every second felt louder than the one before. I was leaving my final appointment when a black SUV rolled quietly to the curb beside me. The windows were dark enough to hide whoever sat inside. The passenger door opened. A gray-haired man in an immaculate navy suit stepped onto the sidewalk. He didn't smile. He didn't introduce himself until he was standing close enough to offer me an umbrella against the cold spring rain. "Miss Emily Carter?" he asked. I nodded before common sense could stop me. "My employer has an offer." My stomach tightened. "I don't have anything left to sell." His expression never changed. "Your brother deserves to live." Those 6 words followed me into the vehicle before I even realized I had climbed inside. The leather seats smelled new. Soft instrumental music played somewhere beyond the tinted glass. No one spoke for nearly 20 minutes as downtown skyscrapers disappeared behind us, replaced by winding roads lined with towering oak trees and iron gates that opened without a sound. Every mile carried me farther away from the life I understood. Finally, the man handed me a single folder. There was no contract inside. Only Noah's complete medical file, an approval notice from the hospital, and confirmation that every expense had already been paid in full. My heart stopped. "Who did this?" I whispered. He looked straight ahead. "The man you're about to meet. What does he want from me?" For the first time since entering the SUV, the older man hesitated. Everyone assumes they know the answer. The gates closed behind us as a sprawling stone estate appeared beyond the trees, glowing beneath rows of warm lights against the darkening sky. Men in tailored suits stood quietly along the entrance, their expressions unreadable. Somewhere inside that mansion waited the man newspapers never photographed and politicians never named aloud. I took one shaky breath as the front doors slowly opened. Then I heard a calm, commanding voice echo from somewhere beyond the marble hallway. "Cancel the auction. She's not for sale." The words echoed through the entrance hall with a calm authority that silenced every whisper around me. Nobody argued. Nobody even looked surprised. The men standing along the marble walls lowered their eyes as though the decision had already become law. I remained frozen beneath the towering chandelier, rainwater still clinging to my jacket, unable to understand why someone I had never met had just stopped something I did not even know was happening. The older gentleman beside me gestured toward a wide staircase. "Please follow me, Miss Carter." My legs felt strangely heavy as I climbed each polished step. Every corner of the estate reflected quiet wealth instead of excess. Oil paintings lined the walls. A grandfather clock marked each passing second with slow confidence. The air carried the faint scent of cedarwood and fresh coffee. It looked less like the home of a criminal empire and more like the residence of a family that had existed for generations. That somehow unsettled me even more. We stopped outside a pair of dark wooden doors. Before the older man could knock, a deep voice answered from inside. "Come in." The office was larger than my entire apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked rolling green hills disappearing into the evening mist. Bookshelves stretched across one wall. A fireplace crackled softly despite the cool spring weather. Behind a massive walnut desk stood the man everyone had come to obey. Damien Moretti looked younger than I expected. Maybe 33. His charcoal suit fit perfectly without calling attention to itself. Dark hair framed a composed face that revealed almost nothing, while steady gray-blue eyes rested on a document in front of him instead of on me. He signed one final page before placing his pen down with deliberate precision. Only then did he raise his eyes. They were not cruel. They were simply impossible to read. "Emily Carter," he said evenly. "Your brother is recovering well." My heart skipped. "How do you know that?" "Because I made certain he received the best care available." I swallowed hard. "Why?" He remained silent long enough for the fire to become the loudest sound in the room. Finally he answered. "Because children should not lose their future over money." I stared at him, searching for the hidden condition that surely had to follow. "What do you expect from me?" He folded his hands together. "Nothing tonight. There has to be something. There will be rules." My pulse quickened. "What kind of rules?" He stood and walked around the desk with measured steps before stopping several feet away, leaving enough distance that I never felt cornered. "You will stay here until your brother is discharged and fully protected." "Protected from what?" Another pause settled between us. "The people who arranged this transaction do not appreciate unfinished business." I felt the room tilt slightly. So I really was traded. His expression tightened for the first time. "No." He spoke quietly, but every word landed with unmistakable certainty. "They believed they were selling you. They were wrong." Before I could ask another question, a housekeeper appeared carrying a tray with tea and fresh bread. Damien stepped aside and thanked her by name. She smiled warmly before leaving. It was such an ordinary moment that it completely shattered the terrifying image I had built inside my mind. He turned back toward me. "You will have your own room. Your own privacy. Nobody enters without your permission." I blinked. "Including you?" His answer came without hesitation. "Especially me." I had spent the entire drive preparing myself to lose every choice I had left. Instead, the most feared man I had ever met quietly handed one back to me, and somehow that frightened me even more. Sleep never came that first night. The room they prepared for me overlooked a quiet lake where the moon shimmered across the water as if nothing complicated had ever happened in the world. The bed was softer than anything I had ever owned. Fresh flowers sat on a small table beside the window. A stack of books rested on the shelf. Someone had even placed a framed photograph of the Chicago skyline near the fireplace, almost as though they knew I would miss home before sunrise. None of it made sense. I had expected locked doors and constant fear. Instead, I found silence. The next morning I woke to the scent of cinnamon and fresh coffee drifting through the hallway. My phone, which had been returned to me the night before, vibrated on the nightstand. My heart nearly stopped when I saw Noah calling. I answered so quickly that I almost dropped it. His voice sounded stronger than it had in weeks. He told me the doctors were smiling now. He said they had moved him into a private recovery room with large windows and his favorite breakfast. Then he laughed and asked if I had secretly won the lottery. Tears filled my eyes before I could answer. I simply told him that kind people were helping us. It was the closest thing to the truth I could manage. After we hung up, I found a handwritten note outside my bedroom door. "Breakfast is served whenever you are ready. No pressure. No schedule." The message was signed only with the letter M. Downstairs, the dining room overlooked endless gardens blooming with white roses. A woman in her 60s greeted me with a warm smile. She introduced herself as Margaret, the house manager, and insisted I eat before asking any questions. She treated me less like a guest and more like someone she genuinely wanted to see healthy again. Every employee I met smiled naturally. No one appeared frightened. No one rushed nervously whenever Damien entered the room. In fact, When he walked through the breakfast area 20 minutes later, everyone simply greeted him with quiet respect. He remembered every name. He asked one gardener about his grandson's baseball game. He reminded the chef not to skip his own medical appointment. He thanked the security team before leaving for a meeting. I watched from across the room, unable to reconcile the man standing before me with the terrifying stories whispered about him. Margaret noticed my expression and poured more coffee into my cup. "People only know what they hear," she said softly. "Very few know what they actually see." Before I could ask what she meant, Damien approached our table. He placed a thin folder beside my plate. "Your brother's latest test results," he said. "Everything is improving exactly as expected." I opened the folder with trembling hands. Every report carried positive news. Every specialist had signed the same conclusion. Noah was finally moving toward the future we had almost lost. I looked up, overwhelmed by gratitude and confusion all at once. "How do I ever repay you?" Damien held my gaze for a long moment before answering. "By believing that your brother deserves a normal life." "And what about me?" I asked quietly. Something unreadable crossed his face before disappearing just as quickly. "You deserve one too." Then he turned and walked toward the front entrance where several executives waited beside polished black vehicles. One of them began discussing contracts the moment Damien stepped outside. He listened for only a few seconds before stopping in the middle of the conversation. His voice remained calm, but every word carried unmistakable authority. "Remember the first rule of this house," he said. "Power means nothing if it costs someone their dignity." Every person around him nodded without question, and for the first time since arriving, I realized the greatest mystery inside that estate was not why people feared Damien Moretti. It was why the man everyone called dangerous seemed determined to protect pieces of me that I had almost forgotten still existed. Days slowly settled into a rhythm I never expected to find inside a place I had once feared. Every morning I called Noah before breakfast. Every afternoon the doctors sent another encouraging update. His color had returned. His energy was improving. He had even started arguing with the physical therapist about walking farther than they recommended, which sounded exactly like the stubborn little brother I had known before his illness stole so much from him. Knowing he was smiling again made it easier to breathe. I could not spend every hour sitting in a beautiful room waiting for life to happen, so I began helping wherever I could. Margaret caught me setting the breakfast table one morning and laughed softly before pretending not to notice. The chef eventually allowed me to chop vegetables after discovering I actually knew my way around a kitchen. One afternoon I found the head gardener struggling to carry several heavy flower pots across the courtyard. I rolled up my sleeves and spent the next hour planting white roses beneath the old oak trees. Nobody asked me to do any of it. It simply felt wrong to receive kindness without offering some in return. Something unexpected happened after that. The house slowly became louder. The staff smiled more often. Conversations lingered a little longer over coffee. Even the security team, who had seemed carved from stone on my first day, began greeting me each morning. One guard named Lucas confessed that his daughter wanted to become a nurse. Another proudly showed me photographs from her high school graduation. It felt strangely ordinary, and perhaps that was what surprised me most. Late one afternoon I wandered into the library searching for a novel to distract myself. Sunlight poured through tall windows, filling the room with warm gold. Damien stood near the shelves reading through several business reports. He looked up only briefly before returning to the pages in his hands. "Finding something interesting?" he asked. "I was hoping to," I answered with a smile. Without another word he walked toward a different bookshelf, selected a worn hardcover novel, and placed it gently on the table beside me. "My mother read this every spring," he said quietly. "She believed good stories reminded people who they wanted to become." Before I could respond, his phone vibrated. One glance at the screen changed the thoughtful expression on his face into the calm focus I had seen during his meetings. He apologized, wished me a peaceful afternoon, and disappeared through the double doors. I watched him leave, realizing that every conversation with Damien ended before I could truly understand him. Later that evening I passed the conference room on my way back upstairs. The door stood slightly open. Voices drifted into the hallway. Several executives were discussing expansion plans, financial reports, and security concerns. Someone mentioned my name. The room fell completely silent. Damien spoke next, his tone measured but unmistakably firm. Miss Carter is not part of any negotiation. She will never be treated as leverage. That subject is permanently closed. No one challenged him. The meeting simply continued as though a final decision had already been written into history. I quietly stepped away before anyone noticed I had been standing there. Back in my room, I stood beside the window watching lights shimmer across the lake below. I had entered that estate believing every act of kindness came with hidden conditions. Yet every passing day made that belief a little harder to defend. The more I learned about Damien Moretti, the less he resembled the stories whispered outside those gates, and the more I wondered whether the greatest secret inside that mansion was not the empire he controlled but the lonely man who carried it all without ever asking anyone to understand him. 1 week later the estate no longer felt unfamiliar, but I still reminded myself every morning that none of this was supposed to become permanent. Noah called after breakfast with more good news. His doctors had cleared him to begin light physical therapy, and he sounded stronger with every conversation. He kept asking when he could see me again. I always smiled before answering because I refused to let him hear the uncertainty in my voice. Soon, I promised. Very soon. After hanging up, I wandered through the East Wing searching for Margaret. I found her in a quiet sitting room sorting through stacks of correspondence. She looked up with the same gentle smile she always wore. Someone has been waiting for this, she said, handing me a sealed envelope. My name was written across the front in neat handwriting. Inside was a complete copy of Noah's hospital account. Every balance had been marked paid in full. Every medication. Every specialist. Every follow-up appointment. There was even a reservation for a private rehabilitation program that would continue after his discharge. Attached to the final page was a receipt from nearly 2 weeks earlier, dated before I had ever stepped through the gates of this estate. My hands began to shake. Damien had arranged everything before I even met him. Before I had agreed to anything. Before he could have known whether I would cooperate at all. This cannot be right, I whispered. Margaret looked at the papers before meeting my eyes. It is completely accurate. Why would he do this before knowing me? She hesitated for only a moment. Because some decisions are made from principle, not convenience. I carried the folder through the quiet hallways until I reached Damien's office. The door stood slightly open. He was alone, reviewing financial reports beneath the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. He looked up as I entered and immediately noticed the papers in my hands. You found them, he said calmly. You paid everything before I ever arrived. He closed the folder in front of him without denying it. Yes. Why would you take that risk? He leaned back slightly, considering the question as though it deserved an honest answer. Because if your brother had waited for negotiations, he might have lost time that could never be returned. I stared at him, searching once again for the hidden condition that never seemed to appear. You did not even know whether I would come. I knew you would choose your brother over yourself. His certainty caught me completely off guard. You speak as though you already knew me. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth before fading almost immediately. Sometimes character is easier to recognize than identity. The room grew quiet again. Outside, wind stirred the trees beyond the terrace. I lowered my eyes to the receipts in my hands. People are going to believe I owe you everything. Damien stood and walked toward the window, keeping the same respectful distance he had always maintained. Gratitude and debt are not the same thing, Emily. His reflection appeared in the glass beside mine. One is freely given. The other is demanded. I have never wanted the second. Before I could answer, a soft knock interrupted us. One of his senior advisors entered carrying several folders. The man stopped abruptly when he saw me, then glanced toward Damien with visible concern. "The board has arrived early," he said carefully. "They wish to discuss the Carter arrangement." Damien's expression remained perfectly composed, but something colder settled behind his eyes. He accepted the folders without looking away from me. "Then it is time they understand there has never been an arrangement to discuss." The atmosphere inside the estate changed before sunset. I could feel it without anyone saying a word. Conversations became shorter. Security officers quietly took new positions near the entrances. Luxury sedans rolled through the front gates one after another, carrying men whose expensive suits could not soften the weight they brought with them. From the upstairs hallway I watched them enter the conference room with expressions that never quite reached politeness. Lucas noticed me standing there and offered a reassuring smile. "Everything will be fine," he said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. I wanted to believe him. Instead, I returned to the library, opened the novel Damien had given me, and discovered I had read the same page 4 times without remembering a single sentence. Nearly an hour passed before raised voices drifted faintly through the hallway. Not shouting. Not anger. Simply the unmistakable sound of powerful people disagreeing. I never intended to listen, but when I walked toward the grand staircase, I realized the conference room door had not fully closed. One sentence reached me clearly. "She represents unnecessary risk." Another voice answered, colder than the first. "The agreement was already made." Then Damien spoke. He never raised his voice. He never needed to. "There was never an agreement involving Miss Carter." Silence followed. One of the older men finally replied. "People outside these walls believe otherwise." Damien answered without hesitation. "Then they are mistaken." Another pause settled over the room before someone spoke again. "Compassion is expensive." Damien's response came immediately. "So is losing your principles." I quietly stepped back before anyone realized I had heard enough to understand one thing. I was not the problem. I was the argument. I returned to the garden where evening sunlight painted long shadows across the white roses. Margaret found me sitting beside the fountain with my hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had already gone cold. She sat beside me without asking questions. After several minutes I finally whispered, "They are fighting because of me." She looked toward the house before answering. "No. They are disagreeing because they cannot understand him." "Understand what?" A gentle breeze carried flower petals across the stone path. Margaret smiled sadly. "Most people believe power exists to protect itself. Damien believes power exists to protect others. Those ideas rarely live peacefully together." Her words stayed with me long after she returned inside. Later that night another call came from Noah. He sounded happier than I had heard in months. His physical therapist had told him he might return home much sooner than expected if his progress continued. He excitedly described walking farther down the rehabilitation hallway without stopping. Every word filled my heart with relief, yet guilt quietly followed close behind. While he was rebuilding his future, I was standing at the center of someone else's conflict. After we ended the call, I walked onto the balcony outside my room. Lights still glowed from the conference room below. Damien eventually emerged alone. His shoulders looked heavier than I had ever seen them. For a brief moment he stopped beneath the old oak tree where we had planted the white roses together. He looked toward the balcony, and although darkness separated us, I somehow knew he realized I was there. Neither of us spoke. He simply offered the smallest nod before walking back inside, carrying the burden of a decision that everyone else seemed determined to make more difficult, and for the first time since arriving behind those gates, I feared that the greatest danger was not waiting outside the estate but growing quietly among the people who already stood within it. The next morning began with hope. Noah called before I even made it downstairs, his voice brighter than it had been in months. His doctors had approved another round of rehabilitation, and if everything continued improving, he could leave the hospital within days. I laughed with him for the first time since this impossible journey had begun. When we ended the call, I stood by the bedroom window watching sunlight spread across the lake, telling myself that perhaps life was finally beginning to turn towards something ordinary again. That illusion lasted until noon. Margaret found me arranging fresh flowers in the library. She looked calm, but there was concern behind her gentle smile. "Damien had to leave unexpectedly this morning," she said. "There is nothing for you to worry about." I nodded, although something inside me already knew those words were meant to comfort rather than convince. The estate felt different without him. The staff still smiled, but conversations were quieter. Even Lucas checked the security monitors more often than usual. Late that afternoon I wandered into the greenhouse where warm sunlight filtered through rows of glass panels. The scent of lavender and rosemary filled the air. I had just begun trimming a few fading flowers when hurried footsteps echoed across the stone path outside. Lucas appeared at the entrance, breathing harder than I had ever seen. "Miss Carter," he said carefully, "I need you to come inside." "What happened?" He hesitated. "Nothing that should frighten you. We simply need everyone indoors for a little while." His choice of words told me far more than his explanation. As we crossed the courtyard, several vehicles rolled quietly through the front gate. Damien stepped out of the lead sedan, removed his suit jacket, and handed it to one of his associates without breaking stride. He looked exhausted rather than angry. His tie was slightly loosened, something I had never seen before. Yet the moment he noticed me standing near the entrance, his expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Are you all right?" he asked. I blinked in surprise. "You are asking me? I always ask the person who matters most in this situation." Before I could answer, one of his advisors approached carrying several folders. "Everything has been handled," the man reported. "There will be no further discussion." Damien accepted the folders with a simple nod, then turned back toward me. "I apologize if today disrupted your peace." I looked at him for a long moment. Did something happen because of me? He could have avoided the question. Instead, he answered honestly. "Some people believe protecting another person makes a leader weaker." "And what do you believe?" A faint breeze carried the scent of blooming roses across the courtyard. Damien looked toward the gardens before quietly replying, "I believe the opposite." We walked together toward the greenhouse in comfortable silence. For the first time since arriving, I noticed how tired he truly looked. Not physically alone, but emotionally, like someone who had spent years carrying responsibilities nobody else wanted to understand. Inside the greenhouse he paused beside the row of white roses we had planted together. One bloom had bent beneath its own weight after the previous night's rain. Without a word he gently straightened the stem and secured it to a small wooden support. "Sometimes," he said while adjusting the ribbon with remarkable care, "strength is not holding something tighter. It is making sure it has what it needs to stand on its own." I watched his hands move with quiet patience, and in that simple moment I realized he had never been speaking about the flower. He had been speaking about me. And for reasons I could no longer deny, my heart was beginning to trust the one person I had once feared the most. 3 days later I stood in the hospital parking lot watching Noah walk toward me without assistance for the first time in months. His smile was brighter than the spring sun breaking through the clouds above Chicago. He wrapped his arms around me so tightly that I laughed through tears. Every sleepless night, every impossible decision, every prayer whispered in empty waiting rooms suddenly felt worth it. The doctors told us his recovery was ahead of schedule. They expected him to regain his full strength if he continued working hard. As we drove away from the hospital, Noah talked nonstop about returning to school, seeing his friends again, and finally eating something other than hospital food. I listened to every word, grateful that ordinary dreams had returned to his life. Yet somewhere beneath my happiness lived another feeling I could no longer ignore. I kept wondering what Damien was doing hundreds of miles away. The estate had quietly become part of my thoughts. So had the man who had never asked for anything in return. When we arrived back at the estate that evening, the atmosphere felt unexpectedly peaceful. Margaret welcomed Noah as though he were family. Lucas carried his overnight bag upstairs despite Noah insisting he was strong enough to do it himself. Laughter echoed through the hallway. For the first time since arriving, I saw the house filled not with uncertainty but with genuine warmth. Later that night a handwritten note appeared beneath my bedroom door asking if I would join Damien in the library whenever I felt ready. I found him standing beside the fireplace with 2 cups of tea waiting on the table. Rain tapped gently against the tall windows while the fire filled the room with quiet light. He smiled faintly when I entered. "Your brother looks healthy," he said. "He does," I answered softly. "Because of you." Damien slowly shook his head. "Because of the doctors, the nurses, and because he never stopped fighting." I reached into my pocket and placed the hospital receipt on the table between us. Every balance still reads 0. "I have spent days trying to figure out how I could ever repay this." He looked at the paper only briefly before sliding it back toward me. Then he opened a leather portfolio resting beside the fireplace and removed a single document. He placed it gently in front of me. "What is this?" I asked. "Your freedom." I stared at him without understanding. The document confirmed that every arrangement connected to my arrival had been permanently cancelled. My name appeared nowhere except as the person receiving full release from every obligation anyone had ever claimed existed. There were signatures, legal seals, and final approvals. Everything had already been completed. "You are free to leave tomorrow morning," Damien said quietly. "Or tonight if you prefer." I could barely find my voice. "You are not asking me to stay?" He looked into the fire for a long moment before answering. "If someone remains because they have no choice, then nothing meaningful has been earned." The room fell completely silent except for the soft crackling of burning wood. Finally he looked back at me, and for the first time I saw not the powerful leader everyone respected but simply a man willing to accept whatever answer I chose. "Love that depends on a locked door is not love," he said. "It is only another prison. I promise your brother a future. I promise you a choice. I intend to keep both promises." As I held the papers in trembling hands, I realized the greatest gift Damien Moretti had ever given me was never the money, the protection, or even the hope he restored to Noah. It was the simple certainty that my life had always belonged to me, even when the rest of the world had tried to convince me otherwise. I left the estate the following morning just after sunrise. The gates opened quietly behind Noah and me as the city slowly awakened beneath a pale golden sky. Damien did not come outside to stop us. He did not send anyone to change my mind. True to every promise he had ever made, he gave me exactly what he believed every person deserved: a choice. For the next several weeks life settled into something that almost felt ordinary again. Noah returned to school with more energy than I had seen in years. I went back to the rehabilitation clinic where my coworkers welcomed me with hugs, questions, and more coffee than anyone could reasonably drink in one shift. Patients smiled when they saw me. Children laughed during therapy sessions. On the surface everything looked exactly as it had before. Yet every evening, when I locked the clinic doors and walked toward my car, I found myself remembering quiet mornings beside the lake, Margaret's gentle wisdom, Lucas proudly showing photographs of his daughter, and a man who had possessed every opportunity to control my future but had chosen instead to protect it. One rainy Friday afternoon I received a handwritten envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph. The white roses we had planted together beside the old oak tree had fully bloomed. There was no message except one simple sentence written neatly across the bottom. They finally stood on their own. I smiled before realizing tears had already begun to fall. That evening I drove farther than I had planned. Mile after mile disappeared beneath my tires until familiar iron gates appeared through the rain. I parked outside and walked toward the entrance carrying nothing except the photograph folded carefully inside my jacket pocket. Before I reached the front steps, the doors opened. Lucas laughed the moment he saw me. "I had a feeling you would find your way back," he said. Margaret embraced me as though I had been gone for years instead of weeks. The warmth in that house had not disappeared with my departure. If anything, it felt even more like home. Damien stood near the fireplace exactly where I had left him on my final night. He looked genuinely surprised for the first time since we had met. "Emily," he said softly, "is everything all right?" I nodded. "Noah is healthy. I am back at work. Everything is exactly the way I hoped it would be." He waited patiently, never assuming another word. I stepped closer until only a comfortable distance remained between us. "Then why are you here?" he finally asked. I took a slow breath, remembering every moment that had brought me to that room. "Because you never asked me to stay." Confusion briefly crossed his face. "I thought that was what you wanted. It was what I needed." I smiled through tears that no longer came from fear. "But there is a difference between leaving because someone sets you free and returning because your heart chooses the road back." The room became perfectly still. I reached into my pocket and handed him the photograph of the blooming roses. "You once told me that strength means giving something what it needs to stand on its own. You did that for Noah. You did that for me." His eyes rested quietly on the photograph before lifting to meet mine once more. "You were the first man who proved I was never something to own," I whispered. "You simply reminded me that I always had the right to choose." A slow smile, warm and unguarded, finally reached his eyes. It was the first time I had ever seen the weight he carried become lighter. Looking back now, I understand that the greatest acts of love are rarely the loudest. Sometimes they arrive as an open door instead of a locked one, as freedom instead of possession, and as the quiet courage to let someone leave, trusting that if what you built together was real, they would one day find their own way home.